Hi, in this video I'm going to be answering the question of whether Atlantis is in the Arctic region, or generally speaking, near the North Pole. Now, this is kind of like our view of Atlantis as a tropical paradise, or at least a place with lots of lush vegetation, lots of wildlife, and it's kind of seen as a paradise in a sense. But could Atlantis have possibly looked more like this? That is, could Atlantis have been a land that was just like frozen in ice, basically? That is different from what we expect when we really have hear about Atlantis, but that's just the kind of Atlantis that we're familiar with from pop culture, and that's not really the actual text that Plato provides us. So let's look a little bit deeper into the history of the general idea of a civilization that that is existing at the North Pole or in the polar regions, and how that idea is related to the Atlantis story specifically. And so the idea of a general civilization and a people inhabiting the northern regions of the Earth is an idea that's much older than um, the an idea. It's an idea that has roots in the ancient times, and specifically in ancient Greece. There was said to be a fabulous realm of eternal spring located in the far north, beyond the home of the north wind. And its people were blessed, long lived, and untouched by war, hard toil, and the ravages of old age and disease. And this kind of sounds like Atlantis before its decline, before its descent into immorality and aggression. The Atlanteans were said to be a blessed and not necessarily long-lived. Plato's dialogues never specify whether how long the Atlanteans lived, but they were certainly said to have lived in peace and were blessed and lived in this fabulously um, uh, fertile land that was called Atlantis. But there's one problem with this idea that's coming from ancient Greece, and these people who are specifically named Hyperboreans. And of course, Hyperborea is a name referring to their specific location. So it's possible that the Hyperboreans and the Atlanteans were one and the same people. And that because it's possible that the same race and the same people and the same civilization could have different names. For example, the United Kingdom and Britain are both referring to the same place, and also America and the United States. Those two um, those two names are often considered interchangeable. And so, just a little bit more information on these people. This is where the Greek god Apollo. Okay, the Greek god Apollo was said to have been born on the Greek island of Delos, where a shrine was created to him. And Hyperborea is a place that Greek heroes such as Perseus and Hercules visited while they were on their quests. So it's not just like this obscure part of Greek mythology. This is a location and a place that is an important setting within Greek mythology. The question is Hyperborea and Atlantis, are these two mythological realms referring to one and the same place? First of all, Atlantis wasn't likely to be in the polar regions because it was really described by Plato in a specific sense. And whatever fragrant things there are now on the earth, whether roots or herbage or woods or essences which distill from fruit and flower, grew and thrived in that land. And clearly, that is not really describing a land that we would expect to find in the polar regions today. And another quote from Plato's dialogue says that there was provision for all sorts of other animals, both for which live in lakes and marshes and rivers. Well, of course, there can be lakes and rivers in a polar region, but marshes? I think marshes can only really be found at most temperate latitudes or in subtropical and obviously tropical latitudes. So the idea of an Atlantis being in the polar regions doesn't seem to really find that much support from Plato's dialogues. But then again, Hyperborea, which is described as a land of eternal spring, that shouldn't have been in the polar regions either. And it's clearly described as such a land that is both in the polar regions and has eternal spring and isn't in an eternal winter. And so the existence, the idea of Hyperborea and Atlantis, whether they are the same thing or whether they are different, is just inconsistent with the idea that we know that the polar regions were not only just as cold as they are now, but they were even colder during the ancient times. Because when Atlantis was said to exist, which was around 12,000 years ago, that was when the Earth was just coming out of its ice age. And we can expect the Atlantean civilization existed for quite a long time before it was ultimately destroyed. So we are supposing that this civilization of Atlantis existed during the ice age in the polar regions. And that's just inconsistent with the description that is provided by Plato. But nevertheless, there have been, even in a time when the idea of an ice age had really become almost an established fact, there have been many supporters of the North Pole as the origin of civilization, whether that civilization is Atlantis, Hyperborea, or in the case of one of these individuals, I'll be discussing the origin of the Aryan or the Indo-European peoples. So William Fairfield Warren was one of these individuals who supported the idea of both an Atlantis and a Hyperborea. He believed that the two were one and the same, that originated in the North Pole. And Warren was actually the first president of Boston University and a professor of theology. And in 1885, just a brief mention, he lived a very, very long time, 96 years, which is really incredible for a person in the 19th century. And so he wrote a book called Paradise Found, the Cradle of the Human Race at the North Pole, in which he suggested that various myths and religious traditions seem to all point to the existence of an ancient people, an ancient civilization from which all future civilizations had originated, that was at the North Pole. And if you notice the date of publication, it's 3 years after Ignatius Donnelly published the Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. And so we can really see the influence of Ignatius Donnelly's work. I very much doubt that this book would have been written if Donnelly's work had never been published, which first suggested the idea of this lost civilization that is the root of all these other civilizations and cultures. And so another important author who supported the idea of the North Pole as the origin of not all civilizations maybe, but a significant branch of human civilizations is Bal Gandhar Tilak, who was the leader of the Indian independence movement. And in fact, one of the first leaders, if not the first leader of the Indian independence movement. And in 1903, he wrote a book called The Arctic Home in the Vedas, in which he proposed that the North Pole was the original home of the Aryans during the pre-glacial period. And so all of these ideas seemingly contradict the idea of the Ice Age as we know it today, because it would have been even colder in the Ice Age. It would have been even colder, obviously, during the Ice Age than it is now. So the idea that there were people living in the North Pole at a certain time in the past is just because we know that the Ice Age lasted for tens of thousands of years, and so the idea that people could have been living at the North Pole itself, not just close to the North Pole, but literally within the Arctic Circle, is seemingly contradictory to what we know today. And it's important to mention one other supporter of the idea of a civilization being at the North Pole. And this person is Helena Blavatsky. I made a video about Helena Blavatsky's ideas, and so I'll be really brief, but she believed that Atlantis and Hyperborea were actually not one and the same cultures, but two completely different cultures that had, and that specifically the Hyperboreans had preceded and come before the Atlanteans. And so Helena Blavatsky believes that yes, they both existed, but they were two distinct peoples and civilizations. And so for the Hyperborean theory or the Atlantean theory as the Atlantis in the North Pole theory to be true, the concept of the Ice Age has to be significantly modified or completely discarded. Because if Atlantis were at the North Pole, then what we know about Atlantis was that it was not described as a very cold and ice-bound place in Plato's dialogues. So it would mean that the poles were warmer more than 12,000 years ago than they are today. But we know that that's not true if the Ice Age theory is correct. And so the idea that the Ice Age never happened is a very, very fringe idea that is really, that most people don't just say outright. They kind of hide that kind of claim, and they try to not directly attack the idea of an ice age because there's a lot of evidence that supports it. For example, we have paleoclimatological data from tree rings, oxygen isotope ratios, ice cores in the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets. We have sea level records from coral reefs, and we have geological evidence that suggests that there was an ice sheet in North America as recently as 10,000 years ago. And so it's possible, of course, that the Ice Age really never happened or didn't happen in the way that scholars believe that they did as of now. But it would take a lot of new information to overturn that theory. And some individuals who have suggested that the Ice Age either didn't happen or didn't happen in the way that scientists say that it did is Graham Hancock. And in Fingerprints of the Gods, he suggested that the coasts of Antarctica were ice-free more than 10,000 years ago, which allowed us, supposedly an ancient civilization, to map the coastline of Antarctica. And that this ancient knowledge was encoded in maps that dated to only around 500 years ago, for example, the Perseus map and other maps. And so to conclude, the idea of the Ice Age, the idea of Atlantis, or any civilization for that matter, as having existed in the polar regions, can really only be a viable hypothesis if what we know about the Ice Age is either partially or completely wrong.